So good morning, all saints. Those of you here and who are still coming, and also those of you online, it is my great pleasure to welcome you. My name is Sally Howard. My pronouns are she, her, and I am acting rector for one more week until our rector returns for homecoming. Just a couple quick practical things. There are restrooms right outside the store if you need restrooms. If you're online and you lose connection, don't panic because this forum is being recorded and you can see it later this week. And so now, I am thrilled to welcome one of my sheroes, human rights advocate and activist Jane Olson, to the All Saints Forum. And also to say that she is starting her book tour here with us. So we are blessed and lucky. The story of Jane's lifelong commitment to the healing power of humanitarian action in the world is literally one of life putting faith into action, which we try to do every week here at All Saints Church. As we mark another 9/11 anniversary, a date that has become so emblematic of a world tearing itself apart by polarization and sectarian violence, Jane's embodied leadership, bringing people together for the betterment of humankind, is an example which both inspires and informs us as we continue to live out the values of courageous justice and radical inclusion in our beautiful and broken world. An All Saints member for decades, Jane has been at the center of much of the church's iconic peace and justice history. She will share some of that history with us today and how she understands her work in the world at large to be rooted in the All Saints community. Her new book, World Citizens: Journey of a Humanitarian, is a narrative of light and hope in the midst of unimaginable human suffering. The stories of life-saving impact of humanitarian intervention, presence of love and healing and justice, and the importance of that hope that one person and one community can make a difference in this world is at the heart of this book. And I'd like to mention that the book will be for sale or is for sale after the forum today, and Jane will be happy to sign copies, or if you brought copies like mine, you can also get it signed there. So without further speech from me, let's warmly welcome Jane Olson.
Thank you, Sally, and I want to just tell you I'm so proud of your ministry, and I know you've done yeoman's work this summer in Mike's absence. I hope Mike is online, and I want to greet him also. I know I have several grandsons who were watching online today, so love to everyone. You know, it's so wonderful that we finally are coming back to meeting in person after a long hiatus. I'm a hugger. It's hard to hug on a Zoom call. So some of you I've already hugged, others I don't want to miss the opportunity, so stay around. The official homecoming for All Saints is not until next week. Homecoming Sunday is always a great celebration with parties on the lawn and everyone coming back after long summer holidays. But I want to say that for me today really feels like homecoming. I really feel I'm coming home to this place where I've spent so much time in this church and in this room. I know I'm going to cry, but I want to especially greet Mary Regis, who walked in, and to thank her for being here. Because as you can imagine, George Regis's name is going to come up quite a bit today. Sally mentioned the title of my book, and I want to tell you that that book is really, and all the journeys that I took as a human rights advocate and humanitarian all over the world, all of those journeys are rooted here at All Saints. I'll talk about that in a minute, but I also want to say thank you to Sally for mentioning that this is an auspicious day, 9/11. I happened to be in New York on 9/11, 2001, and I was walking towards the Empire State Building for a 9 a.m. meeting at the Empire State Building. And many people believe that would have been the next target. You know, a couple of planes were abandoned because at security at JFK. But I spent that week there and saw a coming together of that city that would have warmed everybody's heart. I mean, everybody was equal on that day. Those covered in ash who were walking up from the south of the city, I was staying about Midtown, were greeted warmly. People were offering shelter, cash, food, water. Everybody was one and equal on that day, and it lasted for quite some time in New York, which is just remarkable. It brought out the best. But I wanted to ask what would have happened if we had paused for a moment after that shocking series of events. What if we had asked, what on earth would compel 20-some young men to commit that violent act of suicide and kill so many people? What were the conditions in their country that would lead them to have no hope? If we had just taken that pause, instead of jumping into war, an eye for an eye, we might not be suffering some of the consequences of ongoing wars and devastation around the world today. I just want to ask that because that's very much a part of my work, is looking for oneness, for what makes us more alike than different, seeing myself in the face of others, feeling the shared energy as humanity, and looking for seeds of hope. And there always are seeds of hope in the worst of devastation. A lot of inspirational survivors I met were my teachers. They ministered to me. I learned about the power of the human spirit. I wished we'd had it on 9/11. And I really learned to ask those questions here at All Saints. Questions about what could we have done differently to avoid violence. This church has always stood against war. During the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, our former rector, our beloved George Regis, along with Rabbi Bierman of Leo Baeck Temple in West Los Angeles, decided to convene a major conference that would be at All Saints and Leo Baeck about the nuclear arms race. And I don't know why, but they hired me to be coordinator of that conference. Now, I had done a lot of volunteer work and a lot of volunteer work at the church. I was a Sunday school teacher. I was a Girl Scout leader. I was a soccer team mother. I was co-founder of the Pasadena Art Workshops. It's now the Armory Center of the Arts. But I had never planned a big conference. But I had more confidence than ability, and George seemed to have faith in me, so I said, sure, I'll do that. And I spent about 4 months on the second floor of the office building in a converted storage closet planning that. And I must say the experience that gave me has been useful my entire life. It's, you take one step at a time. My first step was to get a broom and clean the office. Practical. And then in October of 1979, more than 1,200 people came to this church from all over the country for a 3-day event that focused on nuclear weapons and the risks they pose to all life on Earth. Speakers included prominent physicists, economists, labor leaders, retired military officers, there were several retired generals, and clergy from all faiths. Because that conference was so successful, people wanted an ongoing program, and we decided to organize a nonprofit organization called the Interfaith Center to Reverse the Arms Race. And I was co-founder with George and Leonard, and I chaired that board for many years, despite having less credentials than anybody else there. We had the president of Caltech was on our board. Norman Lear was on our board. Need I say more? But, you know, I've always had more willingness than perhaps talent or ability, and that's really what it takes in life, just saying, sure, I can do that. Let's see what the first step is. The Interfaith Center put on some amazing programs that attracted wide publicity and participation. It was deep in the Cold War, and the polarization between the Soviet Union and the United States was so palpable that we decided we wanted to put a face on the enemy. We wanted to meet Russians. We wanted to have them come here. We invited a big delegation from the Soviet Union that included a lot of just ordinary people. There were teachers, artists, and obviously a couple KGB officers came with them. And we housed them in our homes, All Saints parishioners. We housed them in our homes, took them all over the city. We had a lot of programs, introduced them to other churches and synagogues and the Islamic Center. And in the end, we came together, and as the Soviet visitors and all the Americans involved, and decided we could agree on one thing: nuclear weapons must never, ever be used, because we liked each other and we didn't want to hurt our friends. You know, once you knew Oleg and Svetlana, never would you want to drop a bomb on Moscow, right? So because of the major nuclear arsenals that the US and Russia had, war between us was absolutely unthinkable. It would have meant the end of the world. So instead, we fought proxy wars. We fought wars in third world countries. And we divided countries and leaders. We labeled them as either fascist or communist. The US supported the fascists, I have to say that's true, and the Soviets, the communists. In Central America, the fascist dictatorships were so brutal that people started pouring north to our southern border. Sound familiar? Just like it's been happening quite recently. You know, by the tens of thousands, and were stopped at the border, met with fear, etc. And at that time, All Saints decided to declare itself a sanctuary church. We wanted to provide sanctuary and safety for asylum seekers. So our members pitched in, offered shelter and food, but we also set up a committee to educate our membership and wider, and we had people coming from all over. We set up a Central American committee, and we learned about, you know, what was happening in various countries. And then we decided that All Saints would send a delegation down to Nicaragua and El Salvador. The Reverend Dick Gillette, who many of you may remember, led that delegation. He had trained as a young priest at a seminary in Nicaragua, and I joined him along with a man and a woman who were a generation older. The man actually was a prominent oil company executive and a conservative Republican, and it gave real balance to us, which was very important. So we stayed at the seminary and traveled all over the country. We drove all the way to the northern border with Honduras, went to many villages. I delivered duffel bags full of clothing that All Saints had contributed to children. And at first I wanted to apologize because the clothing was old and used, but I found all the children were basically naked, and they were so grateful for that. But right across the border, the US was training Contra soldiers to fight against the Sandinistas that they considered to be communist. We learned an awful lot about not necessarily trusting what our leaders say about the power of the enemy, because these were really very humble and desperate people. I wrote a whole chapter about that visit and about the people that I met that inspired me. One of the women was a prostitute who was trying to learn to sew and find another means to support her children. And she had to give up a pretty steady income in dollars in order to do that, but she was so lovely, and I still hold her in my heart. So when I came back from that trip, I understood that this was my path. I really wanted to go around the world, meet people, investigate conditions, and devote my life to that. I didn't know how it was going to happen, but I knew that I first had a more important job, and that was raising our 3 children. My son Steve is here. I hope you'll say I did a good job. And supporting my husband's busy legal career. Now, I've never been sorry for that, because that's the most important work, being a wife and mother and launching these children. But my next journey came in 1989, after our youngest graduated high school. I was invited to go to Ukraine with about 100 American and Europeans and 100, the delegation was 100 American and Europeans combined, and 100 Russian and Ukrainians. We went on a boat starting in Kiev down the Dnieper River to Odessa. And at every city between Kiev and Odessa, we stopped and got out, went in and met and talked to people, spent a day or 2 days, depending on the size of the city. These were cities that had been closed off for the entire duration of the Cold War, not just to foreigners, but to other Soviets as well. People who lived there in cities like Zaporozhye, that we're seeing where the nuclear power plant is, Dnipropetrovsk, Cherkasy. We're learning the names in the landscape of that region every day now with the war that's going on. They had never seen Americans. And I realized stepping off the boat that first day that I was representing America. There were several other All Saints people, because the group that organized this trip was based in Connecticut, and they came right to All Saints because we had such a reputation for peace and justice work and for international outreach. So Marty Coleman, who I hope is listening, invited me to go with her. She was our peace and justice volunteer activist, and has been for many, many years. It was just a profound experience. We were greeted with flowers, with dancing, costumed girls, with loaves of beautifully decorated bread. They were so happy to see us and to welcome us. And it was just an amazing experience of meeting the other and seeing self. Profound, and I have 2 chapters about that. But when we came back after that trip, the next year I went back. I was invited to go back, and of course I went. And I took our daughter Kristen, who had graduated college. It was 1990. And also my brother Jack, who was a guitarist and knew the words of music to all the popular folk songs, so the 3 of us went. And that was even greater experience. But I want to tell you today that we happened to be, Kristen and I, in Kiev, in Independence Square, the day before we left on the boat, with thousands, tens of thousands of Ukrainian people waving blue and yellow flags. There's a photo of it over there I want you to see. We were there on the very day in August of 1990 when the Ukrainians first tore down the hammer and sickle flag of the Soviet Union, that dreaded red flag, stomped it on the ground, and raised the blue and yellow flag for the first time. First time. It was a brave, very courageous, rather audacious act. And it took another full year before they actually achieved independence, because, after the Gorbachev coup and so on, I happened to be in Moscow during the Gorbachev coup. The Soviet Union started breaking apart, and Ukraine could indeed become independent. So you can imagine that we're watching this Russian aggression in Ukraine with a very personal eye and a lot of personal correspondence from people that I met there and that I've kept in touch with. I was called Mother Goose in Ukraine, and I have a lot of young goslings who were very attracted to my daughter. And we've stayed in touch all these years. So on my Facebook postings, I've posted a lot of letters that I've gotten from a young man in Odessa who's working on the front line in the militia. So the other thing is, on that journey, we learned about the devastating consequences of Chernobyl. On our boat, we had an engineer who had been ordered to go into the power plant at Chernobyl and work there all that week without protective clothing or anything, trying to contain the meltdown, knowing that the meltdown was already happened. And he took us into apartment buildings where a lot of Chernobyl survivors were, very sick and dying, and he announced that he was not going to live much longer either. So when the power plant at Zaporozhye is threatened, I'm really watching that very closely. Well, as some of you know, I got very involved with Human Rights Watch. I ended up chairing that organization and working 30 years to build a community that supports the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and took some trips with Human Rights Watch as well. But my invitation to get involved with Human Rights Watch came directly from the relationships that I made through the Interfaith Center to Reverse the Arms Race, again, directly rooted in this church. The organization was based in New York and very little known in California at that time. It was 1988, and they asked if I would organize a group of supporters for Human Rights Watch, and of course, make some money for them. And again, I was more willing than qualified, but I said, sure. So I rounded up the usual suspects, borrowing my husband's Rolodex. Lawyers are always the most interested in human rights. And a lot of academics, and we met in the conference room at Ron's law firm, and gradually the organization grew and grew and grew, and eventually Los Angeles became a model for some 30 city committees that are now all over the world, Tokyo and Johannesburg and everywhere in Europe. I wanted to just tell you that we started having gala dinners at the time that I was setting table, writing name tags, writing introductions, making the flowers, everything, before we had a staff. And we had human rights defenders from around the world come as our honorees. Every time we did a gala dinner, those human rights defenders were invited to All Saints Church, here to this forum, to talk about their experiences and answer questions. And they always said that of all the audiences that they met during their time in the United States, they thought All Saints Church had the most impressive audience with the most information, the best questions, and so on. So in 1991, when the Soviet Union broke up, we had to close the Interfaith Center to reverse the arms race because most people thought the arms race was nuclear weapons were no longer a problem. And but at the same time, wars broke out between various republics of the former Soviet Union, primarily in the Balkans and the Caucasus. And I was invited by an organization also based in New York called the Women's Refugee Commission to go to Bosnia to investigate reports that that women were being held captive and that rape was being used as a weapon of war. Of course, that got my attention, and I went over to Bosnia for the first time right after my 50th birthday. In fact, most of the work that's recorded in this book took place after my 50th birthday, so there is hope. I just became obsessed with the war of ethnic cleansing in Bosnia. It was so vicious. It was so compelling. It started as an effort to rid Bosnia of ethnic Bosnian Muslims, most of whom had never practiced their religion because they lived under communism. But they were ethnic Muslims, and the Serbs wanted to eliminate them, have them flee or be killed or rounded up or whatever. And honestly, what happened is it was an effort by former Soviet party bosses who were leaders in Serbia and to some extent also in Croatia. It was a land grab. They wanted more power. They just wanted more land and more power. And they wanted to take over Bosnia, which is shaped like a heart and lies between Serbia and Croatia. But in the end, all three ethnicities were pitted against each other. You know, war tends to expand, and the definition of the other and the enemy expands. And I went over there so many times. I have 11 chapters about the ethnic cleansing, the war of ethnic cleansing in Bosnia. One of the chapters is about walking in the footsteps of Princess Diana on the minefields in Bosnia and meeting all the survivors that she met, which was an extraordinary experience. It's a beautiful chapter. I really enjoyed writing that and working very hard on it. I'm able to do this because I was trained as a journalist, investigative reporter, and photographer, and I kept just extensive notes, but I kept them. I kept files in my office, my home office. I even had my plane stubs and hotel receipts and, you know, all my photos. Some of the photos are here, over here. And about 5 years ago, I broke my ankle, and that's when I started writing. I was in a wheelchair, and to keep from going crazy, I started writing. But the first chapters I wrote were about Bosnia because that had the biggest impact on my mind and heart. Another chapter was about being with United Nations soldiers, the UNPROFOR, United Nations Protective Forces, who happened to be from Canada and were guarding a road that we were on very foolishly. It's called Sniper Alley in central Bosnia. And I spent a whole day talking with the Canadian soldiers because the road was blocked, and learned that those soldiers had rescued a hospital in the town where we were headed to, a hospital that was for mentally and physically disabled children. What happened was that town, Fonica, had become kind of a center safe zone for Bosnian Muslims, and they were fleeing from all parts of the Republic to that center town, and they were there by the probably 10,000 or more. It was a center for hospitals for the mentally and physically disabled for all of Yugoslavia, because it was a place where there were healing hot springs. And when the shelling in that town started, as inevitably no place was safe, they started shelling that town. All the doctors and nurses fled and left the children and elderly mentally ill people in that hospital alone for several days, and the Canadian soldiers came and rescued them, and I have some really compelling stories and photos from that chapter. As with my very first trip, I came, every time I returned, I came to All Saints, and I visited George in his office, and I debriefed him because he was always so interested in what was going on. After my first trip in 1992, George asked me to come and give a talk at this forum. And I said, sure. But then I started thinking about it. I had a couple weeks to plan, and I thought, I'm not an international lawyer. I'm not an academic professor. I didn't have any of the credentials. So I thought I had to prove to this audience that I knew my stuff. So I really boned up on all the facts. I started with a brief history of the conflict and then began quoting statistics. How many people killed, the number of refugees and displaced people, rape victims, and so on. And I looked up and I saw eyes glazing over, and I went, oh no. So I dropped my notes and I started telling stories. The story I told that day, which I'm not sure I can get through, so all the time I've worked with this, it still just breaks my heart. I met a woman in Bosnia. Her name was Mincy. I'm 32 years old, Mincy told me. I was an economist before the war began. Serb soldiers surrounded my village and held it under siege for several days, lobbing shells. Then they entered the town and drove us all out of our houses. She proceeded to tell how the Serbs killed all the men and older boys, teenage boys, set the houses on fire, and then loaded her and other young women and children into trucks. She was taken to a schoolhouse where she was held with, I think she said 32 young women in each classroom, small classrooms that only 2 or 3 at a time could even lie down. They were so crowded. And all day and night they were taken out and abused by the Serb soldiers. She said she lost a pregnancy during that experience. Eventually, men from a nearby village managed to rescue her and the other young women and drove them in trucks to a town in central Bosnia that was crowded with displaced Bosnians, mostly women and children. Deeply depressed and traumatized, Mincy curled up, alone with her grief. But then she began to look into the faces of other abused women, and especially teenage girls, and realized that some had suffered even worse abuse than she had. She said, I realized I had to be strong for them. So I gathered a whole family of sisters and daughters. The young girls bore signs of starvation and torture and seemed to be separated from their bodies. So I spoke with the other women survivors, and we decided we had to comfort the girls. They set up a beauty salon for the teenage girls. They gave them beauty treatments and hair treatments and massages, and that seemed to help a lot. But Mincy said, I decided to organize women survivors into a group so that we could all help each other. And I called it the Society for Women Survivors of War Crimes. Survivors, she said, not victims. We refuse to be victims. If we surrender to hatred and revenge, we truly will have lost everything. There were more than 800 members of that organization when I was there, and we were treated to a fashion show by the teenage girls. They happened to have among the group of women survivors a fashion designer from Sarajevo. She happened to be ethnic Serb, but was opposed to the war and fled Sarajevo before it came under siege. And she taught the girls fashion design. I don't want to tell more about the story, but the one thing they were lacking was fabric. And the story is entitled Born Again Burlap. I still have some of the clothes in my closet. Another journey is very connected to All Saints also, and that was a trip to Malawi. I'm hoping that Don Thomas is listening. He told me he would be. Is he here? Oh, Don, you're here. I'm so glad, because you can confirm that this is a true story. In 2003, the Reverend Bill Rankin, who served on the staff of All Saints as a young priest, gave a talk in this forum about the prevalence of HIV/AIDS in the world, but especially in Malawi, where he was working. Many of you know that Bill Rankin died about 2 months ago. And I want to pause for a moment on that. I had sent him a book, one of the first copies that came out, and he died the same week. He had a very weak heart and was so brave for all the work that he did in very, very dangerous conditions. So I'm hoping that his wife, Sally, read the chapter about Malawi to him. Bill told us in this forum that 42 million cases of HIV/AIDS were prevalent in the world at that time, 75% in sub-Saharan Africa. In Malawi alone, there were more HIV cases than in all of the United States and Canada combined. Bill and his wife, Sally, who was a PhD professor of nursing, formed an organization called GAIA, the Global AIDS Interfaith Alliance, Global AIDS Interfaith Alliance. And Don Thomas has been one of their greatest supporters, and he got All Saints really involved. Many All Saints people have gone to Malawi with Don and with Bill. Because Malawi had been a British colony, there were many Anglican churches, and they wanted to work through the churches, especially to erase the stigma that AIDS presents so that people would get tested. There was such stigma attached. And for women and girls, they couldn't be married if they tested positive for HIV. And for the most part, they were infected by the men. A lot of the men were truck drivers and, spread it around. The trip that Don invited me to attend was in 2003. I wrote about it in chapter 27, which is called The Warm Heart of Africa. And I want to read a page from that chapter. If I have time. Do I have time, Sally? Yeah.
We will need to stop at 9:45 the streaming, but
Okay.
this can continue to go on.
Okay,
So-
then I won't read it. I will just say that we went to a women's hospital in Malawi, a visit that I'd really been looking forward to, and we were walking through the wards. On the grounds outside, it looked like picnic grounds. There were women and children everywhere on blankets and with food. They were patients waiting to get in, and many were women in the early stages of childbirth. Inside, there was a hallway where 12 women were sitting side by side in folding chairs in the late stages of childbirth. And I'm telling you, there was not a sound. This is not normal. I was not quiet during my 3 labor and delivery experiences. They were so stoic. They were sitting there waiting for their turn on the bed inside the clinic. Then we walked through a room where women who had already delivered their children were being cared for. I think they got to stay 1 full day. We passed one bed, and when we passed the bed, the woman moaned to me and caught my attention, and I went back and asked the nurse what her name was and what her situation was. Her name was Agnes. She had just given birth to a stillborn baby, And the nurse told me she had lost so much blood that she was anemic already and they didn't think she would survive. And I said, don't you have any blood? She said, there's no clean blood supply in a country that has so much HIV/AIDS. There is no clean blood supply. And I said, what's her blood type? O positive. I said, that's my blood type. And I wanted to donate a pint of blood to her. Well, Don had brought his black leather bag, and he had brought clean needles and IV tubes, and he did a direct transfusion from me to Agnes. The next morning, Don asked me, do you want me to call the hospital and see whether Agnes survived? And I thought about it, and I said, no. I don't want to know. I just want to imagine my blood sister Agnes going home to her 4 children. And that was terribly important to me. So in closing, I just want to say that thank you. Mira is crying, I'm crying. This church has meant so much to me. At the closing of every worship service, the benediction says, go forward into the world in peace, to love and to serve. I heard that as a commandment, and that's what I did as a world citizen. Thank you, thank you. You know, our friend Norman Lear, who just had his 100th birthday, divides people into 2 categories, the wet ones and the dry ones, and I am definitely a wet one. So do we have time for some questions?
Beautiful, beautiful. And thank God that you are a wet one. World has changed because of that. So all of you, you are welcome to stay, and we can have a Q&A time with Jane. The streaming will stop at this point because we've got to let all of people get to service. Can you hear me? Oh, sorry. And I will also be leaving because I'm in that service. But Jane is going to stay and sign books and be here for questions. I just want to thank you again, Jane, for being an inspiration in my life of a woman who could step into such a role, and for many, many people here. So thank you. Hand again.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? I know some of you want to go to the 10 o'clock